Okay.
This is roll 8, slate 1. What was a pet phrase that someone used in the Australian Broadcasting Commission's hierarchy that expresses best their attitude towards coverage of the war?
The idea of the ABC hierarchy was that
Can we express it to who the ABC is so there's no confusion?
the idea of the Australian Broadcasting Commission hierarchy, in the news department at least, was that the news programs were a family affair, and they didn't want the wife and kids watching blood and guts over the 7 o'clock dinner as they watched television news. Therefore, the Australian viewers were deprived of the right to see exactly what was happening in Vietnam and in many other parts of the world, for that matter. A right which the ABC arbitrarily took from them.
Did they still get the film? And
Australian Broadcasting Commission and the commercial television networks in Australia all got the film. They then imposed their own censorship because the news editor of each one of those stations is in fact a designated censor for the government. How they apply that censorship is just up to them. It was applied very rigidly by most of them, not only the Australian Broadcasting Commission but the commercial networks as well. So much so that it wasn't necessarily in line with what the Australian Censorship Board would have cut themselves. They may have allowed much more to be shown on television.
when you say the news editors were the designated censors, what do you mean exactly?
To allow the film to come into Australia quickly without the formality of going through customs and legal censorship by the Australian Censorship Board, I think is the name of the organisation. The news editors of each television station are designated by the government as official censors. It's up to them. They are responsible for the censorship. It seemed to me that they took their duties too far. They cut much, much more than the official censor himself would have cut.
The commercial networks didn't have any representatives in Vietnam themselves, not really, maybe occasional Swans tour. Who then did they receive their coverage from?
The film received by all the Australian networks, including the Australian Broadcasting Commission, was almost invariably mine, from in Vietnam and Cambodia, or from my organisation. I suppose 50% of it would be mine, personally, and most of the remainder was from my organisation anyway, that is Visnews, which is an international news film agency.
So that, who owns Visnews, by the way?
Visnews is jointly owned and administered by the BBC London, large shareholders, Reuters News Agency, also London-based, the Australian Broadcasting Commission have a share, as do the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, I think it is, and the New Zealand National Broadcasting.
Do the Americans have a share in Visnews?
The Americans don't have any share at all in Visnews. That's the reason Visnews was established, was to offer an independent, non-American orientated television news service. Prior to Visnews being established, practically the only source of international television news came from the American networks, and there was a heavy overlay of American interest. It wasn't propaganda as such, because obviously the Americans covered stories of American interest, and so to get away from that, Visnews was established, and quite successfully.
So that you're filming the war, and as far as you're concerned, trying to faithfully report it, but back in Australia the product's being cut, censored.
The product for many years, from 1964 through the late 60s, probably as late as 1970, the my original film was cut drastically in Australia. Elsewhere in the world it was cut much less so. In Australia it was cut drastically. So there was no violence. You'd think the Vietnam War was a war without violence. It was all sweetness and light. Just our boys patrolling and keeping the dreaded communists in check by something being holier than thou. You didn't kill people or something. At least you didn't show them being killed.
Whereas in actual fact it was much more than that.
In actual fact, of course, it was a bloody war just the same as every war is.
After Tet in 1968, did Visnews start to lose their interest in Vietnam?
Yes, when the political repercussions of the 1968 Tet offensive in Vietnam were felt worldwide. President Johnson, of course, announced he wasn't going to run anymore. It was a virtual resignation. As far as my company, Visnews, were concerned, they believed that with the Americans starting to pull out from Vietnam, to disengage, that the war was over. I don't know why they thought that, because the war continued at exactly the same rate for another 7 years until it finished in 1975. The only difference was, of course, that there were more and more South Vietnamese soldiers being killed to replace, I suppose, the lives of the Americans who weren't being killed anymore. The same number of Allied soldiers were being killed week after week. Before, the same number were being killed after 1968 and right through the war as there were before the Americans began to withdraw and after they'd totally withdrawn.
So were they content to leave you there, or what happened exactly?
No, they tried to persuade me to go to London, some sort of job on the desk. I could never fathom exactly what that was, and anyway, I've never worked on a desk anywhere, so I turned that down, and reluctantly they allowed me to stay in Southeast Asia. Then, of course, Cambodia came into the war in 1970, and they found they did have an interest after all. There was certain interest. It raised up, and I went to Cambodia to live.
Why didn't you want to leave Indochina?
Well, I've always felt quite an affinity for Southeast Asia in general, for Indochina in particular. I seem to get on very well with the Vietnamese and Cambodian people and the Laotian people, Asian people in general for that matter. I feel much more comfortable with. I feel it's my home. There's no... I just feel that the Western world is far too materialistic in its outlook and has little time for culture, conversation, the things in life that I value.
Did you have many Western friends there too?
I had quite a number of Western friends. They were far outnumbered by Asian friends, of course, but that's only natural. I was living in Asian countries. But I had a number of Western friends, and I still have. But in the main, they thought perhaps as I do. A lot were married to Asian girls. A lot were long-time residents of Asia. A number of Americans, a few British, a few Australian expatriates.
And just going on from that, your love of Asia and the Vietnam War, which you were in, would you regard the Vietnam War as being the most important event in your life?
The Indochina War in general was easily the most important news story I covered. I don't expect ever to cover a continuing story as important. I still think it's the most important story of my generation. The repercussions, the effects of the Vietnam War, both what went on during the war, the social effects felt worldwide, the political effects worldwide, which are still being felt now, the repercussions of that war, are easily the most important event of our times.
On a personal basis, though, was Vietnam, Indochina, the relationships that you had with people there, was it the major?
Yes. I formed the strongest personal relationships of my life in Indochina. Unfortunately, I lost many, many, many of them, particularly in Cambodia, and to a lesser extent in Vietnam. And when I had to leave Indochina, a good part of me died, in a sense. It's very difficult to recapture that feeling of comradeship that I had with many, many people there. Many people that I will obviously never see again, mainly because they're dead. Good.